My name is Gareth Cliff and you're watching Joburg Today.
There are around 100 derelict buildings in Johannesburg. A few years back, there were around 45 of these buildings. The new administration of the City of Johannesburg says it is a huge challenge to bring these buildings under the bylaws of the city to ensure the safety of residents and to put an end to the harbouring of criminals there. Michaelson, great to have you with us as always.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here always.
Fantastic. We want to talk about the state of derelict buildings in Johannesburg and to really understand from a public safety perspective what are the dangers around that.
Yeah. Christina, let me start by the condition of the building itself. A lot of these buildings in the inner city, especially in the city of Johannesburg, are being abandoned by their owners for various reasons. As you can see, at one stage of this building's life, it must have its glory days. But if you go look at many of the buildings now, it's not a building where people can live. It's not suitable for human habitation. And of course, a lot of the criminal elements and a syndicated criminal element, if I may add, see an opportunity. They illegally occupy these buildings, and eventually, it becomes a business, an unlawful business, I must add. So the owners of these buildings will eventually have to step back and say, what do we do? Do we run to the courts for a relief to say that everyone must be evicted, or do I simply step back and leave things? I mean, I've heard horrendous stories where owners of the buildings are intimidated, threatened, for their life when they try to go and see what's happening with their own properties.
Yeah, these are high-risk investments.
No, absolutely. So, going back to your question, we as the City of Joburg, as the government, we are seeing a lot of these buildings that's been neglected for many, many years. The government before has not done enough, if I can say, to ensure that the investment environment and to retain that investment within the inner city has been kept. Therefore, we're seeing a state of many illegally occupied buildings. The inside of these buildings, Nosina, if you go in and take a walk, it's not for anybody to live. It's worse than some of the half-constructed buildings I've ever seen. Bearing in mind, these are complete buildings at the one stage. Never mind any fire escapes. There are no railings at the stairs. There's no lighting, no water. The one building I went into, the infamous Cape York, that was on fire a few weeks back. We went just in there before the fire started, and there's literally on the top floor, there's an exit that leads out right to the end of the building, and there's no wall, there's no fence or anything to sort of cordon off this very dangerous exit that falls out of the building. I can only imagine if a little toddler has to climb, and there are many of them in these buildings, has to climb and fall. So for us, it's a great concern. We really need to push ahead to ensure that these buildings are being cleaned out, to make sure that the people living in these buildings are moved to a place of safety, and the owners of these buildings can come back and take control of their properties.
How many buildings do you know exists in Johannesburg?
I will give you a guesstimate. There must be over 100 of these buildings in town that's been neglected, and there are many more that, although not occupied, but it's still in a dangerous state because of the condition of disrepair. It's not being cared for, but I suppose the building owners also don't see the economic value in maintaining these buildings. So what they simply do is that they will brick and mortar the entrances and the windows on the ground floor and leave the building to decay. So it's a very sad state of affairs where we see the once glorious buildings that had much economic value had to now deteriorate to its current state.
What is the position from a bylaw perspective when it comes to actually evicting people living in derelict buildings, and when it comes to addressing the condition and state of buildings in a city like Johannesburg?
There are many bylaws In fact, we lose count when we go into a building like this to have to identify the contraventions, the offences, not just the bylaws, but national legislation. And one of the most important is the safety bylaws relating to fire. Our EMS, our Emergency Management Services, the fire inspectors would go out and inspect these buildings, in fact any building, and declare the safety of the building. And again, I used the example of Cape York.
Yeah.
You know, that takes no genius to look at the building and say the building is not safe at all. And we in fact did issue a notice in terms of our city's bylaw to declare the building unsafe. The notice was handed over to its owner, and I think they in effect...
I suppose getting the people out would be a mission as well.
Yes.
There's so much an owner can do if his building's been hijacked.
No, absolutely. It was by a misfortune that the people evacuated from the building. And we were able to say to the owner, he came to the scene that afternoon, he said he's been in a court battle for months. And in fact, he welcomed our notice to say that the building is not suitable for human habitation. It must be, cleared vacant. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge that many of the bylaws, when we do issue a notice or a citation, and we leave for the offenders to comply. Of course, many of these occupants would simply ignore the notices. The building owners have very little power as to encourage or even enforce the building occupants to comply with these bylaws. So it is a real challenge, but that by no means will stop us from continuing to ensure the bylaws are being enforced.
Are you concerned about the harbouring of criminals in these buildings?
We're very concerned. We're extremely concerned. The raids that our colleagues at the city have been conducting shows a lot of criminal activities. And from my own personal experience, that the raids we've conducted, weapons are just concealed in every room that there is in these buildings. I assume they probably for their own protection, but we wouldn't want a situation where there are buildings of people that have weapons, illegal firearms and ammunitions. And again, it's not a safe passage for anybody to be walking up and down. We've caught them on our CCTV cameras in the inner city before, where criminals would come out from these buildings, rob or hijack unsuspecting passerbys, motorists, and simply to very casually walk back into the building. Because it's a best cover for them. Once you're in the building, it's very difficult to identify, because there are not hundreds but thousands of rooms in these buildings. So to go knock down door by door and to search everybody, by the time we get to the second floor, they already escaped. So it's a perfect place for criminals to hide out. And that's also a very important reason that we needed to raid these buildings, so we can get rid of the criminal elements within the inner city.
I know previously when I discussed your strategy as MMC of Public Safety earlier in the year, you told me how important it was to focus on cleaning up the inner city. Are you giving that a lot of focus?
We're giving a lot of focus. We're in fact giving a lot of resources, manpower, woman power. A lot of officers patrol the streets of the inner city. We have vehicles patrolling, so we really want to achieve that element of visible policing. And, just to go further, we can't just be visible on the streets, on the ground level. We really need to penetrate into these problem buildings and to ensure that the criminal elements are being driven out. It's, from as one may think as small as the bylaw management, to ensure the streets are clean, to ensure that we have a very clear passage of traffic, to those elements, these criminal elements that's hiding around the dark corners, in these derelict buildings. And many of them, they will hang around transport nodes like your taxi ranks and bus stops. So all these places are our place of concentration. So we really need to work this even harder to ensure that we flush out the criminal elements, to ensure that the people would feel safe to come back to the inner city, to work, to live. And we're beginning to see a bit of change. The investors are beginning to understand that the new city government is making changes. They're willing to put their monies down where, you know, their business is or was or will be. And that's a very encouraging sign for us as an administration, to ensure that we create this environment that where we encourage investment. Then, you know, the job creation will come through, you know, better living environment, you know, better living standard will come about for the residents and the people that work in the inner city.